Hello, Mark here. Before we begin today's episode, I would just like to quickly take the time to ask all of those who are enjoying the series a favour. If the platform you use to listen to Castings for Ancient Greece has a rating or review system, I would be extremely grateful if you would consider leaving the series a quick review. These ratings and reviews go a long way into helping others discover the show, in turn helping it grow. So if you enjoy the series and can spare a few minutes, I would love to read what you have to say about your experiences with the show. Thanks everyone for your support, and let's get to today's episode. The Spartans voted that the treaty had been broken, and that war should be declared, not so much as because they were influenced by the speeches of their allies, as because they were afraid of the further growth of Athenian power, seeing as they did that already the greater part of Hellas was under the control of Athens. Thucydides. Hello, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Castings for Ancient Greece, episode 71, The Decision. War with Corinth now seemed to be inevitable, with the developments that had come to pass since Athens voted to come to the aid of Corcyra. This decision by Athens had seen tensions inflame to levels seen during the First Peloponnesian War. However, the very real threat to seeing conflict develop between the two and the prospect of a larger war would come about when the ships of the Athenians and Corinthians would engage one another at the Battle of Sparta. Not only had this seen the two now enter into open combat, but it risked the truce of the 30 years' peace made with Sparta. Corinth was a member of the Peloponnesian League, and an aggressive action against it could be deemed as a breach of the peace. Though this would not be a clear-cut breach, as Corinth was attacking Corcyra with Athens in a defensive alliance with the island. Athens would only intervene when Corcyra was at very real risk of routing, seeing that they were not acting out of aggression. However, this would leave some confusion between where diplomatic relations rested between the two. With this uncertainty on such a crucial matter, a level of mistrust would set in, where both would act in their own self-interest if the other were preparing for war. Athens would turn to ensuring that they would be ready to meet an escalation in hostilities with Corinth, should it come. This would see preparations made around the finances of the city, where current commitments would be completed, with then the treasuries looking to store a surplus to finance any coming war. Athens would also turn to geopolitical measures to give themselves an advantage in a future conflict with Corinth. This would see two main actions that would also lead to inflaming tensions further. The first would be an episode known as the Potidaean affair, where Athens would take measures to try and prevent Corinthian influence intervening with their control in the Chalcidids. Potidaea had started as a Corinthian colony and still retained connections to their mother city, though they were also now a tribute-paying member within the Athenian Empire. Athens would instruct the city to take down its walls, evict any Corinthians from the city, and provide hostages to Athens. Potidaea, however, would decide to resist and seek help from Corinth and another of Athens' enemies, King Perdiccas of Macedon. This would see a conflict develop and escalate around Potidaea, where it would descend into the costly exercise of siege warfare. Athens would find itself committing some 5,000 troops and 70 ships to the theatre, while ensuring the hostilities between themselves and Corinth would only strengthen. The other action Athens would take that would come to raise tensions further would take place around the same time as the Potidaean affair, but a little closer to home. This action would be focused on the polis of Megara, where Athens would impose economic sanctions, known as the Megarian Decree. Megara had entered back into the Peloponnesian League after the First Peloponnesian War, but still proved to be an important strategic location in the event of war with any Peloponnesian power. It seemed Athens looked to have Megara seek Athenian aid once again through economic necessity. They would ban Megara from being able to use any port or marketplace within the Athenian Empire, with it thought this might drive the polis back towards Athens. However, this would prove to have the opposite effect, and would see other Peloponnesian cities affected by the flow-on effects of these sanctions. There would be numerous actions and activities undertaken by Athens during this period. However, these two would prove to be the most substantial in seeing the cause for war increased. This episode will be turning to Corinth's attempt to create this conflict with Athens larger by seeking further Peloponnesian assistance and ultimately bringing Sparta into the mix. We will look at the arguments made while we will try and explore the feelings that appear to be present within Sparta around the prospect of a larger war developing as a decision was reached that would alter the course of the classical age in Greece. We had seen that with the situation around Potidaea, that Corinth had sought to prevent their influence within the city being severed. To do this, they would need to take part in military operations against Athens by assisting the Potidaeans in rebelling. However, Corinth looked to remove any blame for breaching the 30 Years' peace by assembling a volunteer force to take on these operations. The force that had been sent would see a great number of Corinthians join, due to the popularity of the commander leading the expedition. Aristeus was a Corinthian, and his father had led the Corinthians during the Persian invasions. As the situation around Potidaea saw a siege develop, Aristeus had recognised that the only hope the city had was for the besiegers to be harassed from other quarters, while additional help from the Peloponnese was also needed. With the siege of Potidaea setting in, trapping many Corinthians and other Peloponnesians, Corinth would now focus on attempting to bring Sparta and more members of the Peloponnesian League into the conflict with Athens. Their main point of argument would rest on that Athens had breached the agreement of the 30 Years' peace. This they saw had happened when Athens engaged them at the Battle of Sparta, with a further breach taking place with the attack on Potidaea, a colony of theirs. However, this was not a simple case to put forward, as Corinth was only going to highlight the points that supported their point of view. Though these matters saw a number of cities involved, with all having some impact on how developments would unfold. Another factor that would be a hurdle was the fact that Sparta had, from the outset of these matters, tried to persuade Corinth to act with a degree of restraint. This we had seen in the talks that would take place on the Peloponnese when the situation around Epidamnus was developing. Added to this was the Spartan suspicion of Corinthian motives, with Sparta assuming Corinth was seeking Spartan support to further their own designs. This would see that Corinth would need to frame their arguments not only in how the situation affected themselves, but how the rest of Greece would be affected by Athenian actions. This would see Corinth arrange that their allies in the current crisis would send delegates to Sparta to air their grievances. Doing this would see that it was not only Corinth who saw Athens' disregard for the 30 Years' peace and posing a threat to the rest of Greece. It appears this tack taken by Corinth would force Sparta's hand, as it was only Sparta who was able to call together a conference of the Peloponnesian League. With this influx of delegates they were about to receive, whether they liked it or not, they would then issue an invitation to the rest of the Peloponnesian League. They would hold an assembly in Sparta where all those who felt they had been victims of Athenian aggression could voice their views. With such a widespread invitation being sent with Athenian actions being the primary focus, of course Athens would get wind of the assembly that was going to take place in Sparta. Athens had not been invited, but Athenian representatives would be sent to attempt to argue Athens' case. Thucydides would tell us that many came forward with various complaints against the Athenians. However, he would only detail a few within his work. We would hear about Aegina coming to Sparta to voice their concerns, though they would do so behind closed doors. The main reason for this was that they were afraid of Athenian retribution. Aegina was not a member of the Peloponnesian League, but it's possible Corinth had invited them along, since they would provide another reason for Athens not upholding the 30 Years' peace. During the negotiations in 445 BC with Sparta, Athens had promised to restore Aegina to its autonomy, but this had not yet occurred. Aegina, being present, would also highlight that Athens was interfering in Greek states being independent, and with Corinth hoping it would show Athens' imperial ambitions over their fellow Greeks. Another city-state we hear coming forward with their issues with Athens was that of Megara. This we had covered last episode when looking at the Megarian decree. It's at this point in Thucydides' account that we actually learn of the existence of the decree. It doesn't get the same focus as the Potidaean affair, but some modern historians have argued it was just as important in seeing the Peloponnesian War develop. Megara's issue with Athens, of course, was that economic sanctions had been imposed on them, which saw that they were banned from entering any port or marketplace within the Athenian Empire. Though Thucydides does say they had other issues with Athens, but does not elaborate on them. Though by far and away the largest focus Thucydides would give in his work was on the Corinthian arguments. These, he said, would come after all the other states with the grievances had put their cases forward, having allowed the previous speakers to do their part in hardening Spartan opinion against Athens. This takes up a few pages within Thucydides' work, but I think it is well worth spending some time around the Corinthian speeches to see how they would frame their arguments. What we find with the speech that Thucydides presents the Corinthians giving was that it quickly addressed the current issues, but then moves on to the bigger picture. Corinth attempts to paint the Athenians and the Spartans in the most extreme negative light as possible. On one hand, Athens is painted as a dangerously revolutionary power. Remembering here, democracy was a relatively new political approach, and Athens seemed to practice the most extreme version of it. While on the other hand, Sparta is painted as slow to act and indecisive. even going as far to question how Sparta received their reputation. These points would be established early on in the speech, when the Corinthian delegation would say, "You can see yourselves how Athens has deprived some states of their freedom, and is scheming to do the same for others, especially among our own allies, and that she herself has for a long time been preparing for the eventuality of war." This line would be continued on with outlining Athens' involvement over Corcyra and Potidaea. Then the speech turns to focus on Sparta's response. "And it is you who are responsible for all of this. It was you who in the first place allowed the Athenians to fortify their city and build the long walls after the Persian War. Since then and up to the present day, you have withheld freedom not only from those who have been enslaved by Athens, but even from your own allies. When one is deprived of one's own liberty, one is right in blaming not so much the man who puts the fetters on, as the one who had the power to prevent him, but did not use it. Especially when such a one rejoices in the glorious reputation of having been the liberator of Hellas." The Corinthian speech continues on with Athens' continued operations in the face of traditional Spartan inactions. This would then see the speech arrive at a point where a contrast is painted between the Spartans and Athenians, highlighting Sparta's traditional approach to international relations was now far outdated in the face of the new innovative and dangerous approach to Athenian geopolitics. To preface this transition in the speech, the Corinthians would also make it known they were not being aggressive towards the Spartans, but merely outlining the faults they could observe. I'll read this section from Thucydides' account, as it really highlights these points of Corinth's argument. "We hope that none of you will consider these words of remonstrance to be rather words of hostility. Men remonstrate with friends who are in error. Accusations they reserve for enemies who have wronged them. Besides, we consider we have as good as right as any to point out a neighbour's faults, particularly when we contemplate the great contrast between the two national characters, a contrast of which, as far as we can see, you have little perception, having never yet considered what sort of antagonists you will encounter in Athens, how widely, how absolutely different from yourselves. The Athenians are addicted to innovation, and their designs are characterised by swiftness, alike in conception and execution. You have a genius for keeping what you have got, accompanied by a total want of invention. And when forced to act, you never go far enough. Again, they are adventurous beyond their power, and daring beyond their judgment, and in danger, they are sanguine. Your want is to attempt less than is justified by your power, to mistrust even what is sanctioned by your own judgment, and to fancy that from danger there is no release. Further, there is promptitude on their side against procrastination on yours. They are never at home, you are never from it, for they hope to be in their absence to extend their acquisitions. You fear by your advance to endanger what you have left behind. They are swift to follow up success, and slow to recoil from a reverse. Their bodies they spend ungrudgingly in their country's cause. Their intellect they jealously husband, to be employed in her service. A scheme unexecuted is with them a positive loss. A successful enterprise a comparative failure. The deficiency created by the miscarriage of an undertaking is soon filled up by fresh hopes, for they alone are enabled to call a thing hoped for a thing got, by the speed which they can act upon their resolutions. Thus they toil on in trouble and danger all the days of their life, with little opportunity for enjoying, being ever engaged in getting. Their only idea of a holiday is to do what the occasion demands, and to them laborious occupation is less of a misfortune than the peace of a quiet life. To describe their character in a word, one might truly say that they were born into the world to take no rest themselves, and to give none to others. Do you want more Casting Through Ancient Greece episodes? Well, I have some good news for you. If you have been enjoying the series and wish to support the show over at Patreon, you can gain access to many bonus episodes, with new ones being added each month. Not only will you be gaining more content, but you will be helping the series grow. These bonus episodes have been taking a deeper dive on subjects we have covered briefly in the series so far. We began at the start of the Greek timeline and have been moving forward, this seeing us having covered topics around prehistory, the Bronze Age, and the Archaic Age. We are now turning to focus on the Greek and Persian War period, with us beginning with the Ionian Revolt. Here we'll be putting in focus, through different episodes, the early contact between the Greeks and Persians, motivations behind the Ionian Revolt, the Persian counter-offensive of the revolt, and then a focus on the final battle of Lade. If you are interested in gaining access to these bonus episodes, please consider heading over to the Casting Through Ancient Greece Patreon page. Not only will you get monthly bonus episodes, but you'll receive early access and ad-free series episodes. Other options also include access to fully referenced transcripts of the series episodes, as well as a forum, where members' questions are answered every month via video. Alternatively, you can visit the Casting Through Ancient Greece website, where you can find the Patreon link, as well as other ways that help the series grow, when clicking on the Support the Series button. Thank you all for listening to the series, and I look forward to perhaps seeing you over on Patreon. Although we saw Corinth made an attempt to show Sparta they were not speaking in an aggressive manner towards them, the speech they do give does give the impression they were berating them in front of their own allies. This, I think, would have made the Spartans angry towards the Corinthians, though it would seem Corinth had tapped into a political divide that had existed in Sparta since the end of the Persian War. We had previously spoken about the so-called peace party and war party that existed in Spartan politics, with it seeming the policies of the peace party had been driving Sparta through a lot of the period since the Persian War. So it would appear, rather than attacking the Spartans as a city and a people, they were targeting the policies of the peace party with an aim of rousing the war party into action to where they would be able to affect Spartan policy towards Athens. With everything the Corinthians say within their speech, what is at the heart of it is a call for immediate action against a dangerous and revolutionary state before they are left to do as they wish any longer. Otherwise, this would see Athens in a position where they'll be able to overwhelm all the Greeks and their freedoms. To make a final plea for action, the Corinthians would end their speech coming back to the current crisis, raising Sparta's previous promise to Potidaea. While somewhat of a threat or ultimatum would be given if Sparta still chose a path of inaction, though how serious they were in this threat is hard to know for sure. Thucydides would present their closing remarks as, "Here, at least, let your procrastination end. For the present, assist your allies, and Potidaea in particular, as you promised, by a speedy invasion of Attica, and do not sacrifice friends and kindred to the bitterest enemies, and drive the rest of us into despair to some other alliance. Such a step would not be condemned either by the gods who receive our oaths, or by the men who witness them. The breach of a treaty cannot be laid to the people whom desertion compels to seek new relations, but to the power that fails to assist its confederate. But if you will only act, we will stand by you. It would be unnatural for us to change, and never should we meet with such a congenial ally. For these reasons, choose the right course, and endeavour not to let the Peloponnese under your supremacy degenerate from the prestige that it enjoyed under that of your ancestors." As we pointed out earlier, there was an unofficial Athenian delegation in Sparta to witness the speeches at the Spartan assembly. It would appear not sending an official delegation was a calculated decision, as Athens had not attacked or targeted Sparta through any of their actions. An official response to defend their current actions to Sparta would be inappropriate, since they were both the leading powers of Greece. They did not need to answer to Sparta for their own policies concerning the direction of Athens. They had not travelled to Sparta with the intention of defending any charges against themselves, but to make a general statement of affairs and careful consideration of what was being decided upon. Plus, one would think Athens being on the ground and hearing the speeches made in the Spartan assembly for themselves would allow for better decision-making within their own assemblies. In effect, the speech that the Athenian representatives gave would summarise, in a few paragraphs, the roughly 50-year period between the two wars that Thucydides recounts, and the roughly 15 episodes we spent focusing on it. Like I said, their intention here was not to address any specific charges that were being laid, but it seems to have had three main objectives in mind. These being to prevent Sparta giving in to the arguments of their allies, show that Athens had acquired its empire justly, and that their power deserved a certain level of consideration and respect when making decisions around war. It's these objectives in mind that Athens would start off with, to help frame their speech and help the assembly understand the context of what was presented. Thucydides would record this opening. "We shall make no reply to the charges which these cities have made against us. Your assembly is not a court of law, competent to listen to pleas from them or from us. Our aim is to prevent you from coming to the wrong decision on a matter of great importance, through paying too much attention to the views of your allies. At the same time, we would like to examine the general principles of the arguments used against us, and to make you see that our gains have been reasonable enough, and that our city is one that deserves a certain consideration. To start addressing these three main points, the Athenians would begin by reminding the Spartans of their record through the Persian invasions. They would begin with the Battle of Marathon, where they would point out that they stood alone. Obviously Plataea had stood with them, but the point here being that Sparta had no role in the Athenian victory. The speech then continued into the Battle of Salamis, where they argued that it was the victory here that saved the Peloponnese from invasion and ultimately saved all of Greece. They would then point out Athens had contributed to this result in three important ways, with Thucydides writing, "We produced the most ships, we provided the most intelligent of the generals, and we displayed the most unflinching courage." Thucydides would then continue on elaborating on these 3 points, explaining how Athens contributed 2/3 of the entire Hellenic League navy. Their commander, Themistocles, would see that Salamis would be fought, while the Athenians stood resolute and ready to fight, with the Peloponnesians wanting to abandon their position, even though Athens had been captured by the enemy. The purpose in outlining these previous exploits during the Persian invasions was to highlight the fact that Athens should be respected when it came to military matters, where Thucydides would have the Athenian representatives say, "We shall not be speaking in the spirit of one who is asking a favour, but of one who is producing evidence. Our aim is to show you what sort of city you will have to fight against if you make the wrong decision." From here, they would then move on to addressing the nature of the Athenian Empire and its coming into being. They had heard accusations of them having gained their empire through tyrannical and aggressive means. However, the Athenians would point out that the Athenian Empire, or Delian League, would be born out of Sparta's inaction. This would then see many cities approach Athens voluntarily, looking for their leadership at a time where the Persians were still a threat. Thucydides continues the Athenian speech with, "Surely, Spartans, the courage, the resolution, and the ability which we showed then ought to not be repaid by such immoderate hostility from the Hellenes, especially so far as our empire is concerned. We did not gain this empire by force. It came to us at a time when you were unwilling to fight on to the end against the Persians. At this time, our allies came to us of their own accord, and begged us to lead them." They would then continue on explaining the power of the empire would grow with the events as they developed, with Athens also having to look to its own interests. They would cite one important factor, this being Sparta's change in stance towards Athens, where they would become hostile towards them. The Athenians then arguing, it's at this stage that they could not risk letting their empire dissolve, lest risk their allies join the Spartan alliance. They would then point out that Sparta was not any different in how they would maintain and control their own allies. The Athenians would then reinforce this point, where Thucydides has them say, "So it is with us. We have done nothing extraordinary, nothing contrary to human nature in accepting an empire when it was offered to us, and then in refusing to give it up. 3 very powerful motives prevent us from doing so: security, honour, and self-interest. And we are not the first to act in this way. Far from it. It has always been a rule that the weakest should be subjected to the strong, and besides we consider that we are worthy of our power. Up till the present moment, you too used to think that we were. But now, after calculating your own interests, you are beginning to talk in terms of right and wrong." The speech then continues on, with the Athenians showing how their critics are very quick to judge them on how the empire is administered, without understanding much about it at all. They point out how Athens, compared to other imperial powers, treats its allies much more fairly, where law courts are often used in the resolution of disputes. However, this can be a double-edged sword, as, if a finding goes against the ally, they are still in a position to complain and make accusations. In the case of other imperial powers, force is mostly resorted to, not allowing the targeted city to be in a position for this sort of recourse. After this lengthy explanation, the Athenians would then close with their warning to the Spartans to think over their decision carefully and not allow their allies to influence a rash decision. Thucydides writing, "Take time then, over your decision, which is an important one. Do not allow considerations of other people's opinions and other people's complaints to involve you in difficulties which you will feel yourselves. Think too of the great part that is played by the unpredictable in war. Think of it now, before you are actually committed to war. The longer war lasts, the more things tend to depend on accidents." Then the Athenians would conclude with, "And so we urge you, now, while we are both still free to make sensible decisions, do not break the peace. Do not go back upon your oaths. Instead, let us settle our differences by arbitration, as it is laid down in the treaty. If you will not do so, we shall have our witnesses the gods, who heard our oaths. You will have begun the war, and we shall attempt to meet you in any and every field of action that you may choose. The Spartans had now heard the complaints from their allies and had heard the Athenians address many of the issues raised, highlighting the view from the other side of the fence. It was now decided that all outsiders should leave and let the Spartans turn to discussing the matters at hand amongst themselves. Thucydides tells us that at this point the majority of the Spartans present at the assembly in their early discussions came to the same conclusions. They were all in agreement that Athens was acting aggressively and war needed to be declared upon them. However, before this decision was settled on, the Spartan king, Archidamus, rose to speak. You may remember we introduced Archidamus some episodes ago, but let's get a quick refresher. King Archidamus was the grandson of Leotychides, who was banished around 469-468 BC. This would see Archidamus come to the kingship at this time, and he would take up the kingship position on the Eurypontid side of the throne. He would earn a reputation as rational and level-headed, as he would guide Sparta through the crisis that ensued after the Spartan earthquake. He would also be an instrumental figure on the Spartan side that would see the 30 Years' peace established with Athens. Now, Archidamus would rise to address his fellow Spartans in an attempt to see cooler minds prevail. He would begin by echoing some of the same sentiments made by the Athenians, with him attempting to have the Spartans really think about what they would be getting themselves into, by stressing this would not be a war like they were used to when engaged with their neighbours. He would also follow the line Athens presented, in that their power should not be underestimated, with Archidamus pointing out areas Athens held supremacy in. Thucydides writes, "This, the war on which you are now debating, would be one of the greatest magnitude, on a sober consideration of the matter. In a struggle with the Peloponnesians and neighbours, our strength is of the same character, and it is possible to move swiftly on the different points. But a struggle with a people who live in a distant land, who have also an extraordinary affinity with the sea, and who are in the highest state of preparation in every other department, with wealth private and public, with ships and horses and heavy infantry, and a population such as no other Hellenic place can equal. And lastly, a number of tributary allies. What can justify us in rashly beginning such a struggle? Wherein is our trust that we should rush on it unprepared? Is it in our ships? There we are inferior, while if we are to practice and become a match for them, time must intervene. Is it in our money? There we have far greater deficiency. We neither have it in our treasury, nor are we ready to contribute it from our private funds." Archidamus would then move on to measures the Spartans could take in a war with Athens, but also highlighted how these approaches were mitigated, or the Spartans' inability to continue support of them. These would be presented around Sparta's strength in its army on land, and how they could enter and ravage Athenian territory. However, the impact of this would be minimal, as the Athenians had plenty of territory outside of Attica, where goods could be imported. He would also focus on Sparta attempting to break the strength of the Athenian Empire by focusing on Athens' allies. This as a strategy could affect the revenue Athens received, while also causing revolts that would have to divert resources to. However, Archidamus would also point out these allies of Athens were mostly on islands, and with their lack of a sufficient navy, Sparta would be in no position to support them in rebellion. This would then see him come around to asking those in the assembly how they supposed they would fight this war. Thucydides saying, "What then is to be our war? For unless we can either beat them at sea or deprive them of the revenues which feed their navy, we shall meet with little but disaster. Meanwhile our honour will be pledged to keeping on, particularly if we are of the opinion that we began the quarrel. For let us never be elated by the fatal hope of the war being quickly ended, by the devastation of their lands. I fear rather that we may leave it as a legacy to our children." However, Archidamus would not suggest that the Spartans roll over and allow Athens to continue their current trajectory. He argued that Sparta was not in a position to take up arms just yet, and that arbitration should be the first course of action. While this was taking place, Sparta should then be taking measures to increase their own position by recruiting more Greeks and foreigners into their alliance, while an effort should also be made on increasing the size of their fleet and building up a treasury. Archidamus argued that if Sparta followed this course of action, then if matters with Athens had not improved, Sparta would be in a much better position in going to war. Plus, he also suggested if Sparta increased their power through these means, it may cause Athens to relent on issues that were brought to them before war would result, acting as a deterrence measure. He would also turn to addressing Corinth's reproach on them, with him saying, "Let no one call it cowardice if we, in all our numbers, hesitate before attacking a single city. They have just as many allies as we have, and their allies pay tribute." Archidamus then continuing with, "As for being slow and cautious, which is the usual criticism made against us, there is nothing to be ashamed of in that. If you take something on before you are ready for it, hurry at the beginning will mean delay at the end. Besides, the city in which we live has always been free and always famous. Slow and cautious can equally well be wise and sensible." Archidamus then continues to talk of the strength of Sparta and their attributes before then rounding out his speech with, "Let us never give up this discipline which our fathers have handed down to us, and which we still preserve, and which has always done us good. Let us not be hurried, and in one short day's space come to a decision which will so profoundly affect our lives and their fortunes, the fates of cities and their national honour. We ought to take our time over such a decision, and we, more than others, can afford to take time, because we are strong." Archidamus would then advise that a mission should be sent to Athens over the matter of Potidaea, and the other claims made by the Peloponnesian allies. He pointed out that the Athenians being open to arbitration, it would be illegal to attack them first. Archidamus would have known that the sentiments of the war party in Sparta had been taken on as a popular view, and he was fighting an uphill battle. How much of an impact his speech had had, he would find out in very short order. Though, before a vote would be held, one of the ephors would stand to give a final address, with it clear he was from the war party within Sparta. The speech he would give seemed to show he was confident that Sparta was in the mood for war, as he would not even bother addressing the arguments put forward by Archidamus. I think it is well worth reciting the speech that Thucydides records. "The long speech of the Athenians I did not pretend to understand. They said a good deal in praise of themselves, but nowhere denied that they were injuring our allies, and the Peloponnese. And yet if they behaved well against the Mede then, but ill towards us now, they deserve double punishment for having ceased to be good, and for having become bad. We meanwhile are the same then, and now, and shall not, if we are wise, disregard the wrongs of our allies, or put off until tomorrow the duty of assisting those who must suffer today. Others have much money and ships and horses, but we have good allies, whom we must not give up to the Athenians, nor by lawsuits and words decide the matter, as it is anything but in the word that we are harmed, but render instant and powerful help. And let us not be told that it is fitting for us to deliberate under injustice. Long deliberation is rather fitting for those who have injustice in contemplation. Vote, therefore, Lacedaemonians, for war, as the honour of Sparta demands, and neither allow the further aggrandizement of Athens, nor betray our allies to ruin, but with the gods let us advance against the aggressors." With this final speech being delivered, the Spartans were then asked to take a vote on if they should go to war with Athens. The Spartans would vote by shouting in agreement to the proposals put forward, with the loudest response winning the vote. However, the ephor claimed that he could not tell which side was the loudest, so sought to separate the two opinions physically, this making it clear who was for and against the motion. It was asked that those who thought that the treaty had been broken, and that the Athenians were the aggressors, to stand and move to one side, and those who did not hold this view to stand on the other. All the Spartans then moved to their respective sides, with it quickly becoming clear that Sparta had voted for war. It is thought here that it was already clear that Sparta had come to this decision when asked to voice their vote, though it appears the war party wanted to make it clear to all the size of the majority that existed on the decision for war. Thucydides would be of the opinion that Sparta had not primarily voted for war out of their opinion of Athens breaking the treaty, or being convinced by their allies, but rather their decision was predetermined, being afraid of the power Athens had accumulated and were concerned of it growing further. However, as we have seen over the last few episodes, it doesn't appear Sparta acted in a way that would give this impression. We had seen as the crisis had been developing, Sparta had been attempting to convince Corinth of restraint towards Corcyra. We also saw that peace was still a popular enough option in Sparta, as the Spartans would not invade Attica when Potidaea was attacked, as they promised to do so. While Athens was given the floor on the Spartan assembly, and Archidamus' speech showed that the peace party was still in favour of maintaining the 30 years' peace. After having read through this period presented by Thucydides' account, I must say I agree with the point that Donald Kagan presents. He says, "It is impossible to avoid the conclusion that if it had not been for Corinth, the Spartans would probably have taken no action whatsoever." It is important to note that the decision in the Spartan assembly was not an official declaration of war. Sparta wanted to have all their Peloponnesian allies present to vote on the motion, though it was clear to all the cities that had been in Sparta at the time that Sparta was now in favour of war. They would all return to their respective cities, including the Athenians, with the knowledge of the mood in Sparta. Over the previous 50 years, we had seen that the policies of the peace party had been more popular when crises were developing, but now the war party had held the most popular view and would see the Spartans take the decision of war. However, as we continue next episode, we will see that Archidamus and the views of the peace party would still be present. We will look at the congress that would take place in Sparta with all the Peloponnesian allies that would result in a formal declaration of war after an ultimatum had been sent to Athens. However, there would still be an action from Sparta, and it would be one of their allies that would end up making the first aggressive move of the Peloponnesian War. Thank you everyone for your continued support, and a big shout out to all those who have found some value in the series and have been supporting it on Patreon and other various ways. Your contribution is truly helping me grow the series. If you have also found some value in the show and wish to support the series, you can head to www.castingthroughancientgreece.com and click on the Support the Series button, where you can discover many ways to extend your support to helping the series grow. Be sure to stay connected and updated on what's happening in the series, and join me over on Facebook or Instagram at Casting Through Ancient Greece, or on Twitter at Casting Greece. And be sure to subscribe to the series over at the Casting Through Ancient Greece website. I hope you can join me next time when we continue the narrative in the series with episode 72, Outbreak of the Peloponnesian War.